Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for Civil Society's webinar, Postro, the challenges facing pro-life advocates. I'm Jack Fowler. I'm a senior fellow at the center, and I'm really pleased and more so honored to have three really important pro-life leaders and advocates with us today to talk about the challenges and maybe even the opportunities facing this movement as in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, which was rendered late last month. So in age order, backwards, I will introduce our three great speakers. And I just want to remind our viewers, if you have questions, you can post them. And my colleague, Caitlin, who is offline, she will mysteriously filch them up through the system. And we will ask them if we have time. I have plenty of questions. So first, I'd like to thank Missy Martinez-Stone for being with us. She is the CEO of Reprotection. It's a new, and I'm going to call it a feisty pro-life organization that uses state laws, local laws, even federal laws, regulations, zoning, you know, name it, to combat abortion clinics and abortionists. And this is a relatively new organization with some really impressive success already. Then we have Ryan Bangert. Ryan is the Senior Counsel and Vice President of Legal Strategy at Alliance Defending Freedom, one of the truly important legal pro-liberty organizations in America. Defending sanctity of life, and also some other very important areas. And then last but not least, my old friend, and by old, I don't mean by age, Chuck, although it may apply, you never know, is Charles Chuck Donovan, who is the president of the Charlotte Lozier Institute. And first, quick question, Chuck, who's Charlotte Lozier?
Oh gosh, that's a long time. She's a feminist who is actually older than I am. She was a 19th century feminist, and she was a medical doctor, one of the first in the United States. She kind of pushed her way into med school in New York and was vice president of the National Association of Working Women. And she defied a young man who came in and said he liked her to perform an abortion on one of her clients. And she did the womanly thing, and she turned the guy into police and helped the mom. So we thought she was a good parallel choice for the Susan B. Anthony list.
And you are, yes, Charlotte Lozier Institute. It's fair to call it the scholarly arm of the Susan B. Anthony list. Would that be fair to say?
Without implying that Susan B. Anthony list is non-scholarly, right. Yes, we are a passel of about 70 very reputational academics, MDs, sociologists, attorneys, data people. And we're taking it to the other side's research and science, which isn't all that good, frankly.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Let's get started with Missy. And Missy, I'd like you to tell us a little briefly about Reprotection, what it does. A little later on in this webinar, I want to get into some more detail about, the hand-to-hand or combat, not literally hand-to-hand combat, although you never know the way things are going post-Roe, and with Jane's revenge, we might see that sooner or later. I think people are going to have to learn how to take a punch eventually. Tell us about what Reprotection does, and then I'm going to read part of your statement that you put out the day that Dobbs came down, and ask you to reflect on that. So go ahead, Ms.
Sure. Reprotection is a new and growing pro-life organization that helps pro-life advocates shut down the dangerous abortion facilities in their communities. A few years ago, it was identified by national pro-life leaders like David B. Wright, the founder of 40 Days for Life, that even though states were passing pro-life legislation or even, general medical regulations, depending on who was in the office responsible for oversight, the abortion facilities were not being forced to adhere to those standards. And so essentially we had all of these laws on the books, but when you looked at the local level, the abortion facilities were essentially unregulated. And so reprotection was started to help fill that gap of identifying how abortion facilities are breaking the law by working with pregnancy centers and sidewalk counselors, and put pressure on the agencies to do their jobs and hold them accountable.
Yeah, and I didn't get started. Didn't the concept start with the lack of a handicapped ramp at an abortion clinic?
Yeah, so the idea started when our founder, her office was right next door to an abortion facility, and she looked outside and she saw women stumbling out of the facility after their surgical abortion. And it was just a quick thought of, shouldn't there be a wheelchair ramp there? And turns out the building itself was not ADA accessible. And so she filed a complaint. She said, there's an oversight here, somebody's not paying attention. And it led to a bigger conversation of, I wonder what other laws they are breaking, and using open records, using her relationships with the pregnancy centers. It was discovered that this same abortionist was not reporting abortions on children. And so that led to the closure of the business.
Missy, you wrote of the reversal of Roe v. Wade. You titled it that this is only the beginning. And here's what you wrote. In states that completely ban abortion, we, and that's reprotection, anticipate abortion businesses will disregard the state's decision and continue practicing unlawfully. And we will be there to hold them accountable. In states that restrict abortion in moderation, we will be there to ensure the laws on the books are enforced properly, and continue to work to shut down the abortion industry altogether. And in states with full abortion access, we see abortionists disregard general medical regulations that have no tie to abortion regulations, and we will be there to hold them accountable. In a way, it seems, Missy, that this is, of course, a tremendous thing that has happened, the Dobbs decision, but it doesn't. It probably affects you less than I would think it would other groups, because as long as there are abortion clinics, you have, I'm going to call them opportunities.
Opportunities. I was raising the alarm the minute the leak came out, and we were beginning to feel hopeful that we were going to see a full reversal of the Roe versus Wade decision, saying, our job is going to get so much bigger. The need for reprotection is actually going to go up. Whereas, the average pro-lifer was thinking, oh, we have this huge victory, maybe things will slow down a little bit. We even had people jokingly say, like, we still have a job. And I said, oh, not only will I have a job, I will have so much more work to do, because we were already working on a state enforcement level and had identified lousy oversight. And so now all of a sudden we have hundreds more laws to ensure are being enforced properly. Even in these states where abortion is illegal, how do we know that that's being applied appropriately? How do we know these physicians aren't exploiting the exceptions? Are we going to see a rise in life and health of the mother because a physician just checks that box in order to give women access to abortions? And so we are scrutinizing every new law, including the abortion bans, at the most granular level on what is the practical implementation of these laws look like.
Thanks, Missy. Ryan, would you tell us, give us a little idea of Alliance Defending Freedom, not just its concern of sanctity of life, but it has about 4 other main areas that is of concern. And then I'd like to know about ADF's role in the law that led to the Dobbs decision. And then I want to talk to you more about a piece you wrote recently in National Review. But tell us first about the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Well, thank you, Jack, and real privileged to be with you today, and Chuck and Missy. So ADF is the world's largest law firm devoted exclusively and entirely to promoting religious freedom. And our mission is to keep the doors open for the gospel. And we do that in a variety of different ways, as you noted. One is we are fiercely devoted to protecting life in the courts, but we also do several other things that are related to and adjacent to that. We protect the rights of conscience of believers in the marketplace. We also work with students and academics in the university setting, as well as K through 12, to ensure that academic freedom and the ability to speak freely is protected. We also recently launched an initiative designed to guard and protect parental rights. And that initiative is focused heavily in the education space, but it also crosses over into a number of other spaces: medical rights, the ability of parents to be informed about their children's condition. We also are working in the space of church and ministry defense. It's called our Church and Ministry Alliance. We represent as counsel and we provide legal advice to churches and ministries all across the country who are dealing and grappling with these issues of conscience, these issues of academic freedom, these issues of speech in the marketplace. And we also very recently launched an initiative designed to take advantage of the Supreme Court's excellence jurisprudence in the space of administrative law, challenging overreach by administrative agencies that threatens religious liberty. And increasingly, that's becoming something that's of concern in the life space, as we've seen the Biden administration attempt to use federal agencies to push pro-abortion policies down on states that otherwise want to protect life to the fullest extent possible now that Dobbs has been decided. So that's what
You're right. I just want to, a little later, we'll talk about that Biden executive order. If you can expand on it at that time, that would be terrific. Yeah, talk about the role of, and I think it's strategic foresight role in this, in what ended up being the Dobbs decision.
Certainly. So Dobbs was certainly a team effort. There were a lot of hands involved in just framing up the Dobbs case, and tremendous credit goes to Attorney General Lynn Fitch, who had the courage to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. ADF had the privilege of being involved in that effort early on when we proposed the model legislation. The 15-week ban that was at issue in the Dobbs case was a piece of ADF model legislation, and we took that to the Mississippi legislature, and several of our attorneys, Kelly Fedora, Kristen Wagner, Denise Burke, working with some very courageous Mississippi lawmakers, worked to get that passed. And of course, the ACLU and other, I mean, they could hardly stand it. They had to challenge it right away, right? It was a matter of days before they had a lawsuit on file. And then we worked with Governor Bryant, and ultimately, one of our attorneys, Aaron Hawley, who's an attorney on staff here, worked directly with the Mississippi Attorney General's office, Scott Stewart, their fantastic Solicitor General. We basically seconded her over to the Mississippi AG's office, and she worked side by side with Scott and Attorney General Fitch to help Mississippi defend that law. And they very capably did so at the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're just incredibly thankful for the Dobbs decision.
Ryan, the day after Dobbs was decided and rendered, National Review published a piece by you. It's titled "The Bedrock of a Postro Pro-Life Agenda." And I want to encourage our viewers to find it and read it. I'm sure there'll be a link to it up in the chat. You wrote that in the short term, the conversation around abortion is likely to become even more contentious. Yep. But you wrote, as this process plays out, citizens and lawmakers who wish to foster a culture of life, which I think is a very important issue that we should talk about, culture of life, should keep 3 pole-star principles in mind. And they are, the first has to do with mother and child. The second has to do with focusing on abortion, Inc. That's what I call it. And the third is, again, it's the culture of life, and it's looking at new and existing laws that should be vigorously and faithfully enforced by appropriate public officials. Ryan, would you tell us, you could have been taking victory laps the day after and just being a legal nerd, but you had a much bigger agenda here. Would you talk about this?
You bet, Jack. I mean, we start with the premise, and certainly we don't want to minimize the victory that Dobbs represents, a tremendous victory that really is a credit to the pro-life movement over 5 decades of tireless and ceaseless work, from the sidewalk counselors to the lawyers in the courtroom. Tremendous victory. But we want to look beyond that, because we know that Dobbs is a pivot point. It's a hinge point. It's not the end. It's the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. I know that cliche has been overused of late, but I think it's true.
It's true.
And so I think we want to understand what is the problem, what is the challenge we face now. And that challenge we face now is abortion is a bad solution to a real problem. And that real problem is there are a large number of women who face unplanned and unintended pregnancies and who lack the resources and lack the support, at least they believe they lack the resources and support to carry those pregnancies to term. And so they turn to abortion as what we believe is a false solution to that problem. And so we believe that building a culture of life responds to that, not just by prohibiting abortion, but by providing women who are seeking abortion with real, meaningful alternatives that are life-giving, that are true alternatives to the pain that they face. And the Human Coalition, a group that we work with that does some fantastic work in this space, regularly polls women that they interact with. And what they have found is that 75% of women who seek abortion, they have told Human Coalition that if they believe they had a different, meaningful alternative, they would take it over abortion. So right there, we know that 75% at least of women who seek abortion, they would prefer a different path if they believed it were available to them. And so the challenge to the pro-life movement is we need to show them that that path is available. And there are thousands of pregnancy resource centers all across the country that are a beginning to provide that, but we need to do more. We need to be very supportive of those groups. We need to make sure that their voices are heard. And of course, we've recently heard from the left that they want to stamp out what they call abortion disinformation. That's their code for, we lost Dobbs, but we're going to silence those who are providing meaningful opportunities for women to seek life-affirming alternatives. So objective number one, we have to make sure that we as a pro-life community are showing women that there is an alternative to abortion, because 75% at least of them would take it in a heartbeat if they believed it was there. Second, who are those who need to be targeted by laws that the states are passing? We believe first and foremost, it's, as you said, Abortion Inc., the abortion industrial complex, those who are profiting from the commercial act of murdering unborn children. That is an unconscionable thing. And I think if people understand that the laws that are being passed target first and foremost those who are profiting from human suffering and misery, that support for those laws is going to be much stronger and on a much firmer ground. So pitching our efforts in the legal space as targeting those who are profiting off human suffering and misery is the right way to go. I think it's exactly what we need to do as a movement, because if you dry up that supply and at the same time you address the demand by providing meaningful alternatives, you are rebalancing the equation in favor of life. But last and not least, though, is enforceability. And this is something that Missy, I think, spoke very eloquently to. We can have every good law in the world, but if no one enforces them, they're literally meaningless scraps of paper. And we have already seen prosecutors all across the country vowing not to enforce their state's pro-life laws. Prosecutors in large cities, even in my home state of Texas, who have said, we don't care what the Texas state legislature says, we're not going to enforce these laws. So we need to think creatively. How can we ensure that the laws are enforced? Missy's organization plays a tremendously important role in that. We also believe that there's cause to give state level officials like state attorneys general in states that want to protect life the ability to concurrently enforce those laws. We also believe medical licensing boards have a role to play. How is it that an act that is viewed as criminal by a state is something that a medical professional can practice and retain their license? That shouldn't be the case. So I think there are reasons for us to look very seriously at how we can properly enforce existing laws and the new laws that are coming on the books in a way that targets and specifically shuts down the abortion industrial complex that we've been talking about.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, Chuck, I'd like to talk to you. I have three questions for you. The first, though, is, again, just briefly tell us about Charlotte Lozier Institute and the scale of it. You said something like there are 70 scholars, essentially, that are, what are they doing? It's just abortion related, right, life related, but give us an idea of this, vast array of big brains you have, and what the main objective and mission is for the Institute.
Well, thank you, Jack. I think I can begin by saying what we're not. We have incredible allies at ADF. Americans United for Life, as you know, a longtime partner in the legal activity. And we love lawyers, but we only have one or two among our associate scholars. So our niche are in the social sciences, in medical science, in data, and as well as in scientific development. So I'll give you two examples. We have done a whole string of studies relying on Medicaid data, actual cost data, for the medical histories of 7 million plus women who are in states that fund abortion. We want to know what actually was the subsequent medical history for those women in terms of mental health, physical health, emergency room admissions. And to the extent that Medicaid documents that, which actually there are hundreds of thousands of cases where they do, we're having incredible findings about the elevated rate of medical complications, for example, from chemical abortion. It doesn't show up in state data, doesn't show up in Guttmacher's data from abortion clinics, but it shows up in the Medicaid data. We find it, we analyze it with a gentleman who's the founder of the public health education program at Johns Hopkins. Another example would be our work on chemical abortion, which is going to be, it is now already the dominant method of abortion in the United States. We are tracking as we can new data on complications that occur among women who take the chemical abortion, because the abortion industry has gotten to the point where they have demedicalized abortion. They're not providing medical care to women. They're shipping them pills and telling them they can proceed with an abortion without verifying that they are pregnant or that they have an intrauterine pregnancy, or ruling out that they have an ectopic pregnancy. So basically they're willing currently, this was pre-Dobbs, to risk women's long-term health for the sake of getting that abortion done. But we're getting into the details of how that's happening and duking it out with the FDA, which is the most abysmal agency in government right now.
Chuck, it's fair to say it was not that long after Roe v. Wade was decided that you became active in the pro-life movement. And I want to applaud your many years of fighting in the trenches. Ryan said something about one of the principles, and I'm not saying, Ryan, by the way, you're putting a load on the pro-life movement, but I'd like to take a little what you said and put it in the mouths of some of our friends on the media left who say pro-lifers do not care. The only thing they care about is stopping the abortion, and that's the end of their concern. Chuck, you've been around this block for a while. Would you dispel that notion? Is it dispellable by your experience?
Jack, my understanding and watching the history unfold was that there was an explosion in the provision of alternatives for women. It came about after a political defeat. You and I were in a shared office in DC a while back, but Ronald Reagan came into office planning and proposing to support a human life bill and human life amendment. He gave it earnest support. They were both defeated in the US Senate in 82 and 83. Some people in the pro-life movement, I think, turned in a slightly radical direction through clinic rescues, many of which were peaceful, but those that weren't got immediate attention. The rest of the movement, the bulk, went out and built pregnancy care centers, including individuals who changed the mission of their organizations. So now we're at 2,700 plus centers. We've done national reports, deal with about 1 million women a year. The cutting in half of the abortion rate in the United States, in my view, is directly attributable to the expansion of alternatives. What's quietly been going on, though, are changes in public policy that get very little recognition. We've had child tax credits passed by a Republican Congress after the Gingrich contract with America in the late 90s. Democrats did not oppose it. It was finally done. They wanted a national child care system. We wanted parents to get the resources. There was an adoption tax credit the same decade. And now we're seeing massive expenditures like Texas, which has passed a $100 million grant program. Most of the pregnancy centers don't take federal funds, but increasing number of them do. And as this fight continues, we think the pro-life side will be the one investing billions of dollars in getting that abortion rate from the remainder of a cut of 1/2 to get it the rest of the way to zero.
So Chuck, a little curveball here then, where Ryan wrote about the culture of life, but in my opinion, you are one of the leading historians of the culture of death. In the early 1990s, you and Bob Marshall wrote a really important book, Blessed Are the Barren, the Social Policy of Planned Parenthood. You told the story of Planned Parenthood from its beginning. You know its DNA. You know its racial obsession. By the way, I'm sure you've all seen stories about there's a school district in Southern California that wants to put a Planned Parenthood clinic in a high school, of course, located in a neighborhood that is 90% minority and 80% Hispanic. But so Chuck, yeah, tell us about the Sauron of the abortion movement, Planned Parenthood.
Well, all I can say is that particular eye of fire is still burning. Planned Parenthood is still the same old entity. They draw mega donations, one of the topics that we don't spend a whole lot of time with because frankly, we wouldn't do this fight if we didn't accept that David could beat Goliath. But you've got Bill Gates, you got Jeff Bezos, you've got Warren Buffett. They are in this fight not because they care about maternal health. They are interested in population control. They're interested in securing the social status of elites in society. And while Planned Parenthood's objective migrated a bit from Sanger's eugenics, it didn't go very far, and it took on the form of population control. They're not talking about reining in Elon Musk. They're talking about reining in minorities and the poor. That's where the clinics go. African Americans in the United States have 3 times the abortion rate of white Americans. Some states it's as high as 5 or 6 a ratio. We've documented that in our state reports. And Planned Parenthood finally got to the point where their own employees realized they were working for someone whose legacy was eugenics and elite bigotry. And so in some of their centers, they've taken Sanger's name off the door, but her heart and soul are still in the group, whether the name's there or not.
Missy, back to you, my friend. I'm curious for some details about when you are really going after a particular clinic. How does it work? What's the process? How do you even know? What's the network? What's it like to deal with city officials or recalcitrant administrators? Never mind, sloppy, dirty abortion doctors. What is an experience like for reprotection as it tries to shut down an abortion clinic?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to answer that question is to actually tell the story of the first one that we closed in Florida. And so we got a call from the faithful pro-life advocates that had served outside on the sidewalk for years and years. A patient had run out of this abortion facility screaming, "Call 911," because she was so afraid for her life. She had a negative reaction to the anesthesia, had complained to the physician that she was having difficulty breathing, and he refused to address it. He tried to just keep on with the abortion procedure, and she was so scared that she was going to die from not being able to breathe that she got herself off the table and she ran out of the building screaming, "Call 911." And it was actually the pro-life advocates that care for women called 911 for her and got her the help that she needed. And so those cases are often referred to us from our partners like Sidewalk Advocates for Life, Heartbeat International, people who work alongside the pregnancy centers and the sidewalk counselors. So they were referred to us. And so we talked to the sidewalk counselors who were there, who witnessed it, got the name of the facility, got the name of the physician, and just did a deep dive based on the records we could obtain legally from the state. Turns out this gentleman was 87 years old. He had had his license revoked before for botched abortions, for all kinds of medical negligence, and had multiple complaints filed against him that the medical board and the health department were not paying attention to. And so we put together a very, very good complaint, and we submitted it. And the first response that we got from the Florida Medical Board was, we do not have regulatory authority over that. And if it weren't for us at Reprotection that know how to navigate bureaucracy, and we don't really take no for an answer, the average Iowa counselor or pregnancy center might have said, oh, if you don't do it, then who else does? But I said, yes, you do. And I actually sent her own code back, explaining and highlighting all of the code that does give her regulatory authority over this situation. Imagine being on a licensing board, have somebody reach out, say, we had a patient run out of the facility screaming, call 911, and you don't see that as a problem. And so when we did not get the response we wanted from the medical board, we went above her head, talked to her manager, talked to their manager, and we eventually made it all the way to the governor's office. Because typically these agencies are either underneath the governor's office or the attorney general's office, depending on the state. Usually health departments fall under the governor's jurisdiction. And so if you have somebody who has run on a pro-life platform, like the governor of Florida has, we bring it to his attention and we say, you need to make good on your word. You have dangerous abortion providers in your state that are endangering women. And so it took us about a year. But the day the medical board opened the investigation against this physician, he closed his doors, and his business has been closed since. So it's a lot of perseverance. It's a lot of holding their feet to the fire. It's the persistence, not taking no for an answer, and then just moving up the ranks of, if you are not going to protect your citizens, then the person above you might, and just taking it to the highest authority that we can, using the relationships that we have.
Missy, when you say we and you say us, there's not a lot of we in the we. There's not a lot of us in the us, right? So there's really, Reprotection is quite a kind of a skeleton crew that's punching, to use more cliches, punching above its weight. And bang.
I have an incredible team. There are 5 of us right now. I need about 3 more researchers and investigators to carry the caseload that we have right now. So we are looking for those positions. But when I say we, I am talking about, yes, our incredible but small team.
Well, let's, Brian, back to you. I want to talk about if you have any concerns strategically, legally, looking ahead, what, and this is, the topic here is, what are the challenges facing pro-life advocates? Well, what would the legal, in the courtroom, jurisprudential, if that's even a word, what would concern you over the next year or two?
Yeah. Well, and jurisprudential most certainly is a word, Jack.
Is a word,
got
okay.
that right. But I think that Chuck was right. I mean, the eye of Sauron is still burning brightly in the legal space as well. Planned Parenthood has not abandoned the field and left the fight. They are very much active. And there are a couple of areas of concern, specifically in the jurisprudential space, that we're keeping a close eye on and actively participating in as a legal organization. One is, there are a number of lawsuits that have been filed, not in federal courts, but in state courts by Planned Parenthood and their allies, challenging pro-life laws on grounds that state constitutions protect abortion. So this is a novel argument. Some states have already found, their state Supreme Courts have already found, Kansas is a great example, a state that many view as a conservative state, and yet their state Supreme Court has found a constitutional right to abortion under the Kansas Constitution. Planned Parenthood is trying to replicate that all over the country right now, challenging pro-life laws in what many consider to be quote unquote red states. And yet the Supreme Courts, they believe, might be inclined to find state constitutional rights to abortion. So that's something that's an immediate issue that we're dealing with in real time right now. Second thing that we're dealing with is, of course, the federal response to the Dobbs decision. President Biden has been pushed by his pro-abortion allies to have what they would call a robust response. I think many of them have been disappointed by what they've seen out of the White House so far. And I think part of that is because it's difficult for the White House to come up with a strategy that's not going to be enjoined in court. But they have found some ways to do that. One is They have issued a guidance under Intella, which is really, it's the statute that requires emergency rooms not to turn away patients who are experiencing physical medical emergencies. It's they call it an anti-dumping statute. But the Biden administration has attempted to use the Intella statute to force emergency rooms to provide abortions in cases of risks to the life and health of women. And of course, the word "and health" is a very important word there because that expands it beyond what the laws of many states require. And the Biden administration says Intella preempts state laws to the contrary. So this is one area where the Biden administration is trying to force abortion back into states that are trying to protect life. Another, of course, is mifepristone, chemical abortions. I think Chuck mentioned this is where the fight is coming to us fast and furious. The Biden administration has already said it wants to protect access to chemical abortions, mifepristone, misoprostol, the sort of the chemical, the pharmaceutical cocktail that's used to induce most chemical abortions. There's something called REMS, which is a FDA guideline that requires that dangerous drugs that are known to be dangerous to cause adverse health reactions, oftentimes have additional layers of protections stacked on top of them. Mifepristone definitely had a REMS attached to it that required in-person dispensing of the drug. So a patient could not obtain mifepristone unless they obtained it directly from a physician. That was suspended during COVID, and the Biden administration has made that suspension permanent. So now that opens up mail order access to mifepristone. I think that's a very big problem. That's something that the federal government under the Biden administration is firmly behind and needs to be contested. The third thing, of course, is we're going to be living in a nation with two different kinds of states. And that's going to, I believe, begin to put some tension on our federal system. And that is, you can have a state that fully protects life and that defines abortion as a felony, sitting right next to a state that defines that same medical procedure as a fundamental constitutional right. That's a very difficult situation that we're stepping into right now, and it raises all kinds of questions about how our states are going to interrelate with each other. We've already been hearing about some of these problems in some of the congressional hearings that we've been witnessing, but how are those states going to interact with each other, having these very different regimes?
We're going to get to the Biden executive order and some other questions. We have about a little more than 20 minutes left. I just need to make a commercial announcement. At American Philanthropic and the Center for Civil Society, I write a weekly email newsletter called Civil Thoughts, civilthoughts.com if you want to subscribe to it. And if you're interested in what American Philanthropic does, americanphilanthropic.com. And the Center for Civil Society, add a .com to that too, and explore. And we have on August 9th, if you go to American Philanthropic and look up events, we have what's called a Scotch Talk. It's not called Soda Talk. It's not called Milk Talk. It's called Scotch Talk, where a few of my colleagues, Ben Domingue, Jason Lloyd, Celia Deem, are going to talk about major gifts. So check it out. My colleague, Caitlin, will put a note up there in the chat. Now, before we talk about the executive order, we have a question from James Shirley. I hope I said that right, who's liking this panel very much. But he says, talking about the cultural life, but throughout these important actions, unborn babies are still not protected citizens in the United States like their born counterparts. What is the most direct path to achieving constitutional protection of the right to life of unborn children? Chuck, can I throw that at you, even though you're, as you may note before, you're not a lawyer, nor do you employ many?
Well, Jack, that is a core question. Why do we even bother with this issue? I mean, the core of the debate is the child in the womb, a developing human being, or a tumor, a parasite, or any of the number of things that the Abortion Incorporated likes to assert. If you didn't believe and have the increasing evidence from science about the humanity of the child, I don't know how you stick with it as an issue or any issue for half a century. So the abolitionists stuck with their issue. The anti-segregationists stuck with theirs. Pro-life is stuck with life because the life issue, because it is a separate and distinct human life. We've argued from the beginning that the use of the word person in the Constitution it applies in different ways to different stages of life and citizenship. But the founders and the laws that grew up around the enactment of the 14th Amendment in the 19th century, they blended in a sense to create a national recognition, nearly universal among the states, that the unborn child is one of us. Now, how do you get that done? Because the court did not get that done in Dobbs, although I don't know exactly how many of the legal briefs asked for it. Many on the pro-life side did not, but a number of them did. And it goes to the heart of the matter. I think where you build on what you've got. We've got several federal statutes that refer to the unborn child. You have the Unborn Victims of Violence Act does. It recognizes that no one except the mother may take the life of an unborn child without criminal penalty. You have the CHIP program, for example, refers to the unborn child as a human being. So Congress could take that step, we believe, under the 14th Amendment. It's what the Human Life Bill says, and declare that for the purposes of statutes in the United States, the child before birth is a person within the meaning of those clauses. It will take immense courage in Congress. If they can't get it all the way to the very beginning of pregnancy, they can begin chipping away at it with more statutory authority. Last thing I would say is that Ronald Reagan, in his 1988 presidential proclamation, referred to the Emancipation Proclamation and deliberately used its language to proclaim the personhood of the unborn in terms of how his administration would proceed.
We have a link. Yeah, Chuck has a wonderful piece in the current issue of the Human Life Review about his experience in the White House, in the Office of Correspondence. But President Ronald Reagan really took his correspondence seriously,
Yes,
and really took the life issues seriously. And it's a wonderful retrospective, not only retrospective piece, Chuck, but also hopeful that Ronald Reagan's views on life still quite inspiring. Ryan, back to you on the same question Chuck just addressed about the essentially the constitutionality of life. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Chuck summarized it very well. The problem, and I think it's a theological problem at bottom, and that is the imago Dei, the image of God, going to be recognized in every human being from conception to natural death? And so building a culture of life necessarily requires that we see that and we recognize that. And I think that it's very difficult for us to have an appropriate respect for human rights at the end of life, as well as throughout life, if we're not recognizing those same principles of human rights at the beginning of life. So I think that Chuck put it well.
Okay. Missy, I'm gonna, if you want to take a swat at that, go ahead. But then we're gonna switch gears, and I'll stick with you, and we'll talk about the executive order after I read a little preamble on it. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, Chuck and Ryan covered it so well. I mean, my area of expertise comes into what is the enforcement of a constitutional amendment look like, and so I can't really speak to how to pass a constitutional amendment, but my questions would always be on the other side. What is that? What is a practical implementation of that look like, and how do we write it in a way that is enforceable, that is protecting the woman, that has accountability and oversight? Those are the things that in these well-intentioned laws that we see, it's sometimes missing. And so
Enforceability factor. Yeah.
Right. And so, just if something like that were made available, it would be wonderful. And I will be here to make sure it's enforced properly.
Well, again, now we're looking at, the topics, the challenges facing pro-life advocates. So one of the immediate, maybe it wasn't much of a challenge, was the executive order that the Biden administration quickly put out. Again, I'm referring to National Review because, that's where I hung my hat for 30 years, and I'm still a contributing editor there. And it published an editorial denigrating the executive order as in this way. It wrote towards the end of the editorial, said, in short, Biden and the executive branch can't do much of anything about Dobbs, and abortion advocates know it. Regardless of the reasons, this order reads, like an angry shout of surrender, a declaration that as much as Biden and his bureaucrats might relish enforcing abortion on demand on the entire country, they have yet to find a way of actually doing it. So Missy, and then Chuck and Ryan. Missy, do you think Joe Biden was the old man on the lawn yelling about abortion, but really couldn't do anything about it?
Yeah, I am not an attorney, and I will.
Don't play one on television.
I don't play one on television, right? But it seemed strange to me that a court can make a decision on behalf of the people to return a decision to the states, only to have another branch of office take it back. It just seems like a huge executive overreach, and I would anticipate a lot of lawsuits pushing back against Biden. But a Supreme Court decision, well, as we see now with Roe versus Wade, is not permanent. It definitely holds a lot of weight and a lot of power. So maybe abortion advocates do feel beat at this point. They feel like they don't have the same momentum that we do. And so we do anticipate, they're going to be scrappy and fight back as much as possible. But I mean, it was a huge victory for us. And so they're going to have to regroup. I don't think they were expecting the decision. I think it shocked them. And so they are really going to have to regroup and figure out how they're going to respond.
Chuck, any thoughts on the executive order?
I think the administration felt like it had to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the Reagan administration originated presidential proclamations. Most of them did not generate effective change in the states. The debate went on. I think they realized it here, but what I'm more perturbed by is the fact that 2.5 months after the leak of a Supreme Court opinion, which is very damaging,
Right.
You have probably 25 suspects who might have had a role in that. We still know nothing more about how that happened. We have the administration being very, in my opinion, laggardly in dealing with what are 3 or 4 dozen attacks on pregnancy care centers, other attacks on churches, mostly Catholic churches that may or may not be related. Or
Yeah,
maybe
not a
part of
single
the time.
arrest. Right.
Pardon?
Not a single arrest in any of these.
Well, not a single. And to be honest with you, with all the law enforcement resources, and we all watch television, so what they do is infiltrate a group or two. The fact that Antifa and Jane's Revenge weren't infiltrated 3 or 4 years ago just boggles my mind, because finding out their inner workings, they put them on the internet. I've been invited to meetings on the internet where if I had been in that field of work, I would have dialed in and learned a lot. I'm not FBI, so I don't do that. But it's just astonishing to me that basically the White House has green-lighted a level of violence that so far has not taken new lives, but I believe eventually it will.
Ryan, one last spin on this executive order, if I may. There was a very unpopular but important Supreme Court decision in the 1950s called Brown v. Board of Education, and unpopular in a huge part of the country, but still the executive branch used its powers to enforce that decision. And here we have an executive branch trying to undermine. I find that very disconcerting. Do you have any thoughts along those lines?
I do find that very disconcerting, and certainly Chuck raises some excellent points that the administration laggardly is probably the kindest way to describe the administration's response to the threats on Supreme Court justices' lives. Certainly, most notably, Justice Kavanaugh, certainly the violence and the destruction that's been wrought on pregnancy resource centers. There are federal statutes in place, including the FACE Act, that criminalize that kind of conduct that have remained unused and untapped by the federal law enforcement agencies. I do think the executive order is more performative, but there are some things in there that I think we need to watch with some concern. For instance, President Biden directed the Federal Trade Commission to begin crafting strategies to eliminate what he would call abortion disinformation, or information about abortion that would be deemed criminal under the FTC Act, or at least illegal. What could that be? Well, that could be such things as informing women that abortion might be harmful to their health. That's been something identified by some of the pro-abortion groups as abortion misinformation, or informing women that abortion is something that they don't need to live a happy and successful life. These are the kinds of things that the pro-abortioners like NARAL have identified as abortion misinformation. So if that kind of a definition is adopted by the FTC, I can see some real information warfare being waged against the pro-life movement by the federal government, as well as by, and again, this is a model for what Democrat state attorneys general can do at the same time, because they also have the power of policing consumer affairs under their Consumer Protection Acts, which is very similar to the FTC. So I am concerned about that aspect of it quite a bit.
This is a question that just came from one of our viewers, Brian, and it says, it seems that the pro-abortion industry is better organized than the pro-life movement. Is there a substantial or renewed effort to reorganize to be more effective? Ryan, I'd like to start with you on that, but I think, Chuck in part touched on one fact, the amount of philanthropic money that is coming to, and has always come to the abortion industry is staggering. I mean, you can't compare. We're maybe 1% of what comes to pro-lifers go to the other side. Just this last week, Mackenzie Scott dumped $275 million on Planned Parenthood. And this is not funny, but it might be funny in another way, but the abortion advocates are complaining that she's not actually using the money to spend to pay for actual abortions, which sort of exposes the bloodlust at the heart of this issue. But to Brian's question, yeah, is the pro-abortion industry better organized, and what is the pro-life movement doing about that, if that's true? And you mentioned Human Coalition. I think that would be a good place to maybe talk about it. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say the word better organized is probably not the best descriptor. Better financed, certainly. You certainly see resources. Look at the recent reporting on Warren Buffett's foundation, where over $100 billion could be waiting to go to Planned Parenthood and other pro-abortion groups upon his death. Look at what the response of corporate America to the Dobbs decision. With one voice, corporate America has condemned the Dobbs decision and pledged their support for women who are seeking abortions through paid time off, potentially even funding their travel. Of course, I think it's ironic that they're willing to pay for abortions, but what about supporting motherhood? What about supporting women who actually need the resources to become working mothers? They're not willing to talk about that.
Is that a legal opportunity in some way, Ryan?
Well, I think that companies certainly have the right to run themselves. Now, some of them could run into legal problems in various states, and I think we've already seen some states raising their hands about that. But I think that it's really a question of corporate priorities,
right.
And this is where you're seeing the ESG movement bear some rotten fruit. And I think that we need some corporate reform. But to your point, I think we're organized, but the resource question is a different question.
Chuck, you've seen this movement from its very roots, and how about that question?
Well, I think the pro-life movement has been resilient. If you talk about it in terms of phases, I talked about the pregnancy center expansion, which is continuing. Public funding efforts are continuing, as well as private. But you'd have to go back to 2010 when it looked like the pro-life movement. In my opinion, I thought we were cooked. You had the Affordable Care Act. The remaining Democrats in Congress were basically destroyed within their party when they compromised on abortion. We were looking at a funding gap that was widening. And yet I think the pro-life movement dusted off the mud from its elbows, got up, politically organized. And the tale of the last dozen years is that we have given the other side a really good political fight. And I see them as reacting to the fact that they've been beaten fair and square on the ground of civility. And I'm glad you're working on it full time, Jack. We got to where we are in the last decade through regular civic action, litigation, states questioning the court, winning elections. And now the pro-life movement in Congress big hidden story. It's populated by African Americans, largest number of pro-life women ever. That whole paradigm of the other side having women on its side is debunked, and it's showing up in leadership. We have a real race. The country is probably 50-50. On later abortion, it's going our way. We have to keep calm and carry on.
Missy, anything quickly to add to that? And then I've got final questions. We have about 4 minutes left.
Okay. I do agree with Ryan that they have more money. However, what I have noticed in doing pro-life work for 16, 17 years at this point is they do not have the grassroots abilities that the pro-life movement has. The fact that we have hundreds of abortion facilities covered day in and day out by sidewalk advocates, 40 Days for Life campaigns. When you go to DC for major decisions, I've been doing prayers and protests outside of Supreme Court since I was a young teenager. Planned Parenthood would pay people to go to these events and to protest at the events, whereas you had hundreds of pro-lifers showing up, not only for free, but paying to be there. When I was at the March for Life this year, it was the first time in almost 20 years I had been at the March for Life, and there was not one protester, not one. It was almost eerie to be at the Supreme Court during the National March for Life, and there is not one protester there. And even after the Dobbs decision, people thought DC was going to be dangerous, was going to be just overrun with angry people. No one was there. They just do not have the grassroots organization that the pro-life movement has. And I think that's been something that has really benefited our movement.
If I could have just 1 minute answers from each of you, and then we'll say thanks. Chuck, my dear friend, what on the, not on the challenge side, but on the opportunity side, what is the Charlotte Lozier Institute excited about doing for the culture of life in the forthcoming years?
Well, Jack, our theme is science and statistics for life. We're shocked by what we're seeing in polling about what Americans don't know about such a basic thing as pregnancy, fetal development. They have to be reintroduced to the concepts of family life and the joys of an extended family. And you're going to see a lot more of our material is going to go back into grassroots education. We want it so that basically any child by the age of 5 or 6 has seen an unborn child in the womb and knows what those babies are doing even in the earliest days. So we'll see a lot of progress, I think, because we have a message that's positive.
Ryan, is ADF seeing progress ahead?
Tremendously hopeful, Jack. And bottom line, the abortion culture is based on a lie and an untruth that women are unable to be successful mothers and parents unless they have access to abortion. And that's just a lie. And they may have money, but we have equity, we have the truth on our side. And so we're very hopeful about the future. We believe the law can be a great teacher. We believe the law can be an instrument for cultural change. And we believe that as we pass sensible and appropriate pro-life legislation and we enforce it correctly, and we couple that with resourcing and equipping the pro-life movement to extend that hand of support, grace, gratitude, and love toward women who are in need, we believe this is a moment for a real cultural renewal. So we're very hopeful.
Missy Stone, you're upbeat. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the opportunity to shut down a lot more abortion businesses. We can't have abortions if we don't have anybody offering them. And so we see this as an opportunity to hold more abortionists accountable, hold more facilities accountable, and continue to enforce the laws that have now been able to go into effect to hold them to those higher standards or to ban abortion altogether and shut down more facilities.
I've been toiling in these vineyards for 40 years. I am really, I end this hour much more invigorated than it began. It's been a great honor to be with Missy Stone Martinez, Chuck Donovan, and Ryan Bangert, who are doing great things on behalf of innocent life. I'd like to thank my colleagues at American Philanthropic and the Center for Civil Society, particularly Caitlin Nocera, who's been the woman behind the curtain, making certain this webinar worked. So I'd like to thank you all for participating. I'd like to thank the folks who are here watching. Thank you for coming. And we will we'll be putting this up on the center's YouTube channel. So maybe you can share it with your colleagues and supporters, whatever, after the fact. So thanks very much. We'll be back in the month of August with another webinar. This one will be on education reform. And until then, we'll see you. God bless. Thanks very much, everyone.